We begin with day 2 of the January 6th hearings. This time, the committee focused on former President Trump's fraudulent claims that the 2020 election was stolen. We heard directly from key members of Mr. Trump's inner circle about how they told him there was no evidence for his claims of a stolen election. Witnesses included Chris Steyerwalt, the former Fox News editor who called Arizona for President Biden on election night. He was supposed to testify with Trump's former campaign manager, Bill Stepien, but he pulled out of the hearing because his wife went into labor. The committee did play taped testimony from Stepien, who said that he was against the false claims of election fraud. Here are some of the highlights from today.
President Trump rejected the advice of his campaign experts on election night and instead followed the course recommended by an apparently inebriated Rudy Giuliani to just claim he won and insist that the vote counting stop, to falsely claim everything was fraudulent.
There were suggestions by, I believe it was Mayor Giuliani, to go and declare victory and say that we'd won it outright.
It was far too early to be making any calls like that. Ballots were still being counted. Ballots were still going to be counted for days. And it was far too early to be making any proclamation like that.
CBS News chief election and campaign correspondent Robert Costa joins me now. Hey, Bob, thanks for being here. So this was a fascinating hearing to listen to those closest to Donald Trump testify. Can you kind of walk us through who testified today and essentially what they had to say about efforts by the former president and his allies to overturn the 2020 election?
Caitlin, so good to be with you. What was important about Monday's hearing, the second held by the January 6th committee, was that it was able to illustrate through the video testimony of witnesses what happened in the days after the 2020 election. In particular, there was video testimony that was quite jarring from former Attorney General William Barr and former Trump campaign manager Bill Stepien. Stepien was scheduled to appear in person, but his wife went into labor, so he did not appear in person. But still, seeing his video, seeing Barr's video, it underscored how former President Trump made a choice in the days after the election to not listen to Barr, to not listen to his campaign advisors, who said that there's not a path to victory. Instead, Trump moved toward Rudy Giuliani and Jenna Ellis and Sidney Powell and John Eastman, these outside attorneys who were saying to him, you do still have a way to win the election. But that hope, that strategy was not backed up by any credible data or evidence, yet Trump still moved toward that as a goal and a political ambition. The committee tried to tell that story today in various ways, especially about how, at the end of the day, it was a lie.
And Bob, I know you've been reporting on January 6th for so long, and you've been covering every inch of this committee. What new information did we learn today?
We learned a lot of new information. Most importantly, perhaps, was how money was part of the January 6th story. The committee is making its case that this was not just a lie, that this was a so-called ripoff. Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren of California outlined how, based on the committee's evidence and its assessment, former President Trump and his allies were trying to raise money off the false claim that the election was stolen and rigged. And they tried to build that as a critical pillar in the committee's argument.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear from Stepien, considering that the campaign was continuing to raise money even after he says that he told the then president that they didn't win. You know, I was struck by how many former campaign officials who testified today, you know, they were privately opposed to pushing this fraudulent election claim. They say that they were telling the president that these claims were false, but they didn't make any of these concerns public at the time, and I think that's why it was so striking to see it really on video in these depositions. Did they have anything to say about why they didn't make those concerns public at the time when it could have really mattered?
History is always watching, and it will certainly be watching how certain players in the 2020 period handled former President Trump's conduct and his relentless drive to overturn the election. But what today showed us is that former President Trump still has power inside the Republican Party. The reason we are hearing from witness after witness who was close to Trump at the time was for one reason: subpoenas. Subpoenas were issued by this committee to force people to testify under oath, under the threat of perjury, about what exactly happened. And that's a valuable historical document, whether you're on the right or on the left. To hear what people have to say under oath provides a different layer to the truth. And what the truth is what we all want on any particular matter. But in this situation, we've had a lot of news reporting. We've seen articles and books written, and sometimes these are on the record accounts, sometimes they're background accounts. This is the first time it's not just on the record or on background, it's under oath.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important point, and kind of the bigger picture here is that this is significant because these are claims that the former president continues to make. He continues to be a powerful figure, if not the most powerful figure in Republican politics right now, and he is backing candidates who have backed his own false election claims. Do you anticipate anything that we heard today from Stepien, from lawyers, from others in Trump's orbit, changing that dynamic at all, given that it was, on video? Does that do anything to change that dynamic?
Former President Trump, should he decide to run again for the 2024 Republican nomination, could face an uphill fight. There are others out there in the Republican Party who have their own political standing, like, for example, Texas Senator Ted Cruz or Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. And allies of those potential contenders are certainly watching these proceedings and wondering, does Trump's standing have any hobbling because of what's unfolding here on Capitol Hill? That remains to be seen politically. And we do see Trump's allies going to the barricades politically, in the sense that you have the former president's allies on Steve Bannon's podcast as these hearings unfold, defending their conduct, defending what they said and did.
Yeah, interesting to consider potential 24 candidates being the audience for some of these hearings. Speaking of hearings, the next one is scheduled for Wednesday. What are committee members telling you about what we can expect for Wednesday?
So much of the January 6th committee is about telling a story about power, about how a president used power and pulled the different levers of power in the federal government to try to stay in power, to stay in the presidency. We've so far seen and heard about how Trump used his campaign and his lawyers to try to mount a legal challenge at times based on conspiracy theories. What we're going to hear later this week is about how Trump pressured the Justice Department itself, the law enforcement institution in this country. We're going to hear about how he and others around him leaned into the DOJ, asked them to try to find voter fraud, to find votes. And this is going to be a contrast from what we heard from former Attorney General Bill Barr, who used some expletives to describe how he saw the president's perspective on the election. After Barr resigns, there was a vacuum of power inside the DOJ. We're going to hear how Trump tried to fill that vacuum. So many layers to this ongoing story. Robert Costa, thank you so much for your reporting. Thank you.